In the last section, we applied some styling to our header by hooking up the Materialize CSS library and adding in some very special markup to our header component that followed the documentation for making a navbar, essentially. There's just one little thing that I want to point out about the navbar. You'll notice that the navbar really sandwiches up against the side of the screen, like that, and the text that we have is really close to the left-hand edge as well. So this is a slightly undocumented feature. I'm going to say undocumented just because the Materialize library doesn't make it super clear. But essentially, Materialize really requires you to have at least one root component inside, or one root element, I should say, inside of your application with a class name of container. A lot of the different elements and a lot of the different styling that Materialize makes use of assumes that you have at least one root element with the class name of container. So let's add this thing in, and I think you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to change over to my code editor. I'm going to find my app.js file. And inside the app.js file, I'm going to find the top level div, and I'm going to give it a class name of container, like so. So again, this is something that Materialize just kind of assumes that you have somewhere inside of your application on one of your higher level elements. So now when we flip back over, you'll notice that we have a lot more nice styling, or I should say spacing, on the left and right hand sides. And if I start to collapse the screen, everything starts to kind of collapse nicely along with it. And if I go back down to a reasonable zoom in level, then everything gets even better. Okay, so much better than what we had before. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now I want to focus a little bit more on the header itself. At this point, there's really a couple different ways in which it needs to be improved, because it's pretty rough right now. Yes, it looks good, but there's not a lot of functionality around it. So first off, the logo over here on the left-hand side is not clickable. I would really expect that if you click on email over here, it should take you back to like some root route inside the application. In addition, the login with Google button over here, it looks like it's clickable, but if you click it, nothing actually happens. And then finally, the entire goal of everything we're really trying to accomplish right now, which is to change the content inside the header based on whether or not the user is logged in, clearly we have not done really anything around that as well. So a couple different areas to advance on. I think that the best place to get started right now is to make sure that the content shows the header shows the correct content based on whether or not you are logged in. So essentially, we're just going to stay the course here. We're going to acknowledge, yes, this stuff should be clickable, but we're going to come back and address those items later, okay? So that leads us to, how do we figure out if the current user is logged in? Great question. How do we figure out if the current user is logged in? Because that is how we decide what content to show in the header. Well, I want to remind you of something that we put together on the server side of our application a while ago. If I go back to my root server directory, open up the routes file, or excuse me, routes directory, and then open up the auth routes file, you might recall that we put one very little API route handler in here called current user. If a current user, or if a user is currently signed into the application, if like the person who is making the request here is signed into the application, this route will respond back with the model representing the person who is signed in. And so this route right here is the exact way in which we are going to decide whether or not a user is signed into the application. Whenever our application first boots up, we're going to make a request to this route right here. If it responds back with the user model, that means fantastic, we must be logged in. But if it responds back with like undefined or null or just empty response, then that must mean that nobody is actually logged into the application, okay? So that's how we're gonna figure this out. So in short, we wanna make sure that the instant our application starts to boot up, we make an API request to figure out whether or not the user is signed in. So that's our goal. Now, before we just start kind of like diving in head first, I want to remind you about exactly how we handle requesting data or fetching data inside of a React and Redux application. Traditionally, we will set up a React component to make sure that it calls an action creator. And this action creator right here will be responsible for making some type of API request. And then once we get a response back, it will return or dispatch an action. That action will be sent to all of our different reducers, of which one is our auth reducer. And so that auth reducer is going to watch for an action that says, hey, here is a request that figures out whether or not the user is logged in. The reducer will then return some value that specifies whether or not the user is signed in. That will update all the state inside of our Redux store. And then that Redux store, all the state inside of it, will be sent back down to all of our React components. So in short, what we really want to do right now is create an action creator that will make a AJAX request over to this, I just closed it, where'd it go? Over to this route handler on our server right here. So this is going to be fantastic because it'll be our first exposure to how we really do communication between the React and server side of our application. Now this is going to be pretty in-depth the first time we go through it, so let's take a break right now. We'll come back in the next section and start working on our action creator. So I'll see you in just a second.